I'll just briefly give you a little bit of background for the kind of work that I'm going to be presenting here, where I'm coming from on this, and then I'll show you what we did for developing surveys for evaluating RRI policies, attitudes, and practices as part of the audit process at the outset, early on in the project, to get a sense of where things stood at that point. So just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from on this, I'm a social scientist, so my PhD is in sociology, and that's so it's a kind of social science approach to doing this kind of thing. And I do a lot of this kind of assessment structural setup and framework work for a lot of different institutions, including research organizations. So we have the framework for doing this audit survey involved kind of two general categories. One was understanding what's going on in the research performing organizations from the inside out. And for that perspective, we had a top-down element, which was gathering information about the kind of objective statistics and information about what's going on for policies and structures in the research performing organizations around RRI. And then we also had a bottom-up dimension that was understanding attitudes and practices from the perspective of researchers in the organizations. Then the other part of the framework was trying to get a view from the outside in. So what do external stakeholders think about these organizations and how they currently stand on the different dimensions of RRI? The idea was to get a rounded perspective on the kind of existing status relatively early in the project for the audit phase. And all of these are available on the Zenodo community, the GRRIP community page on Zenodo, where you can download the exact measurement instruments that we used. And this is part of the things that we're hoping will be used by others from the project, is to benefit from some of these tools. So I'm just going to show some examples from these tools. Obviously, they're fairly extensive in trying to cover the full range of dimensions of RRI, but I want to give you a flavor of the different measurement instruments. So the first is the research performing organization, the RPO audit survey. This is the one that was aiming to understand at a kind of objective level the kind of statistical perspective of what's going on across the different RRI dimensions. So it involved a web-based kind of standard web survey, but then also an Excel sheet to provide more detailed data entry. So to give you a flavor of what this looked like, in the web form, it was set up with a kind of responsive design where there was question logic built in. So depending on what responses people gave, they were then asked for more and more detail. So one level was understanding what were the existing written policies across the RRI dimensions for each of the dimensions. So gender equality, ethics, public engagement, et cetera. And then if there were written policies, we wanted to capture those at that stage in the project so we could clarify what was already in place. And then we can also see, whether these things change over the course of the project. That was the idea. So for each element, there were questions about barriers to implementing such a requirement if there wasn't, if there weren't detailed things set up for that the dimension of RRI, and also trying to understand in detail if there was a sense of what steps would be needed to implement that aspect of RRI if there wasn't a policy or kind of structure in place already. Where there was a structure or policy in place already, then we asked for details of that so that we could capture it at that stage in the project. And we also asked a little bit about the kind of implementation steps here. So whether there were staff that were assigned to work on this, and were there regular meetings about this aspect of RRI, that kind of thing. So to get a sense of how focused on these issues the organization was at that point. And also about training. what kind of training was available across these dimensions. And then we asked for some specifics about who had been trained and some information by gender and ideally by salary grade. That was the aim to get an understanding, to check, for example, is there an issue where only those at the kind of junior level are being trained, or is there a kind of gender bias in who is getting trained, this kind of thing. We wanted to kind of surface any issues around that. And here I'm showing the example for gender equality, but we looked at this for each of the dimensions of RRI. And you can see that here, same kind of structure, but asking about open access. And then we did some drill down for more detail where it made sense for that dimension. So in this case, about open access, we asked about the % of journal articles that were being published with green open access, like on an institutional repository, for example, the % being published gold open access, and the % where data was being published, to try to get a sense of whether that information was known at that stage, and if so, what were the kind of statistics at that audit stage. And then at the kind of policy level, were there policies saying that open access was required, or is that only like a suggestion if it is in place, that kind of thing. And then what kind of implementation is generally used. So trying to get a sense of the landscape. So we did that across each of the dimensions with the RPO survey. So that was the top-down perspective. We also wanted to get a bottom-up perspective from the kind of researcher view of whether they saw these as important issues, as important things that affect their work. So if they did, then we asked follow-up questions about how it affected their work and whether how their attitudes and practices connect up with the institution. So, for example, there was a question, research organizations in the marine and maritime sector should promote gender equality in their work. So that's an attitude statement. We wanted to measure, see how people in the organization felt about that. And then we started to ask about whether they felt that the organization that they were in was taking steps to promote gender equality in its work. So getting the kind of inside perspective on the institutional kind of climate, in this case for gender equality, but we had similar kinds of questions for each of the dimensions. And again, we also wanted to drill into barriers that they could identify and if they were aware of steps that could be taken to overcome barriers. And we did this for each of the dimensions. So this is showing measurement around open access. We also asked about public engagement. And here we borrowed some language that had been developed and tested for the global RRI survey that had been part of the RRING project, which is a previous project that Gordon was also the coordinator for. And we also asked about societal needs. So we were getting at these different dimensions. And we also wanted to know about external stakeholders. So whether there was experience working with external stakeholders already in the organization, and if so, with what categories of external stakeholders and at what stage. So where were stakeholders being involved if they were being involved? And then finally, the kind of outside-in perspective came from the external stakeholder audit survey. So this was a survey that went to external stakeholders for each of the organizations. We wanted to know information about them. This was also an opportunity to start to gather contact details and consent to store those contact details. We also wanted to understand some demographic information and the stakeholder category that they represented. And then we also wanted to get a sense, before we started asking questions about their view of the organization, about how familiar they were with it and how long they'd kind of been in contact with that research organization. Then we started to ask them about their attitudes and then whether they thought the research organization was taking action already on these different dimensions of RRI. And again, from their perspective, barriers and steps that could be taken to overcome barriers. So the idea was for each of the dimensions, we would get these
Eric,
different
I'm just going to give you a time reminder. I'm very sorry.
No problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is just kind of showing you the examples of the different surveys that we used. We had this framework of these different perspectives, and these surveys are all available for download on Zenodo for people to be able to edit and use for themselves.
Thank you, Eric. It was a great reminder on the extensive breadth of the surveys that we did, both the top-down researcher and then the stakeholder one. So it was an enormous effort, but it produced a wealth of results which built the GRRIP project and gave us our foundation. So thanks very much for your presentation.